It happened at a rally. Amidst shouting, anger and tension, a crowd of protesters stood holding signs, their faces expressing pain and hope. There she was, a young, confident woman, her eyes shining with excitement. She had come to express her position, to take a step towards change. But he noticed her. A policeman, his eyes cold and filled with hatred, approached, his hand resting nervously on his baton. He had no idea who she was. To him, she was just another target. In an instant, he grabbed her arm, twisting it hard, and she cried out in pain. "What are you doing here?" His voice was thick with contempt. The crowd froze, instantly realizing what was happening. No one dared intervene, fear engulfing them, adrenaline rushing through her. He didn't know that he was making a terrible mistake right now. This woman's name was Amanda, and she was the mayor's daughter. Right now, guys, we want to take a short break. Write in the comments what your name is and what city or country you are watching this video from. You are important to us. Yes, you, who are reading or watching this right now. Your comments help promote our channel, make it visible to more people. We incredibly appreciate each of you, because you are our support, our team. Enjoy watching. The crowd roared like a huge living mass, screaming for justice and change. Signs flashed over the heads of the protesters, with the words "Black Lives Matter" written in large letters. The rally was peaceful until they showed up. Helmeted police lined the streets like iron golems, ready to explode into violence at any moment. Emily stood in the front row, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clutching her sign. It was her right to protest. It was her duty to be here. But she knew the police presence had changed the atmosphere. Something was wrong in the air. She had met their cold gazes before, felt their contempt, but she was not going to back down. Then he came up to her, a tall, shaved-headed officer with a grimace of disdain on his face. His eyes blazed with controlled fury, and Emily immediately sensed that this man was not going to maintain order. She had seen it before, people who reveled in their power, especially when it came from someone like her. "Hey, you!" His voice was rough, sharp, like a crack in a cold wall. "Get out of here if you don't want trouble." She turned, trying not to react, but the policeman was already too close. Like a shark smelling blood, he could smell her fear. "I'm talking to you," he said even louder, coming so close she could feel his heavy breathing. "Do you think you can stand here and shout your slogans?" Emily pressed her lips together. People began to gather around her, but no one intervened. They saw what was happening, but fear of the police paralyzed them. The officer grabbed her arm as if he wanted to pull her away from the crowd. "I am here by right," she said finally, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "This is a peaceful rally." His eyes flashed like a predator's. He didn't like that she dared to answer him. "You think you're right?" He smirked, squeezing her hand even tighter, causing her to cry out. "There are no rights for people like you, only the duty to shut up." There was a movement in the crowd, but no one dared to come closer. No one wanted to be the next target. "Let her go!" came a voice from the crowd, but the policeman didn't even turn his head. "Look who's important," he continued, ignoring the screams, his voice growing more and more vicious. "You think your skin will protect you? No way." He pushed her onto the pavement, and time seemed to slow down. Emily felt pain in her knee as she fell, but what was worse was that the policeman was already drawing his baton. Her heart began to pound faster, and her breath caught in her throat. The crowd froze again, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. Someone was filming everything on a camera, but they didn't interfere. "You should have shut up," the officer hissed, swinging his baton. In that moment, her fear turned to rage. She wasn't just a faceless figure in a crowd. She was the daughter of the mayor of this town, and her father had promised to fight injustice. But that didn't matter right now to this officer. She was just another black woman he could hurt. "You don't even know who you're messing with," she whispered, her voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. Emily lay on the cold pavement, her heart pounding in her chest as if it was trying to escape. She felt the air around her fill with tension, as if time had stopped. The officer stood over her, his face twisted in hatred, and there was no doubt in his eyes. The baton in his hand seemed to be an extension of his own body, ready to strike, ready to hurt. "What? You think you're special?" His voice was full of venom. He leaned closer, his breath blowing on her like a cold wind. "You think someone will come to save you?" Emily couldn't hold back her tears, but they weren't from fear. They were from rage, from the way this man looked at her. He didn't see her as a person. Not as a person, only the color of her skin, only an object for his humiliation. "It's not the law," she said quietly, her voice shaking, but not from fear. "It's not right." He chuckled, ignoring her words. "Law, order," he said it as if there was something funny about the very notion of justice. "Law for people like you." He glanced at the crowd, "so they don't forget their place." He hit her sharply on the shoulder with the club, and she screamed in pain, feeling a hot wave pierce her body. Screams of horror were heard around. People began to move closer, but no one dared to come too close. "You have no right," someone from the crowd shouted, but the officer did not stop. "Get back!" His voice grew even more vicious, like an enraged animal. "Does anyone want to try? Come on! Does anyone else want to be anywhere near this?" He paused, looking at Emily with cold hatred. "This filth?" Emily tried to rise, but her arms buckled beneath her. The pain from the blow still reverberated through her body, but worse was the humiliating helplessness. She knew no one would come to her aid. It always had. A black woman, attacked by a police officer. In that moment, all her knowledge and connections seemed useless. Her father might be the mayor, but here, on these streets, she was just another target for anger and racism. "You're just a nobody," the officer continued, his face twisted with anger. "Come here, I'll teach you how to behave decently." He grabbed her by the hair and jerked her up. Emily screamed, tears pouring from her eyes. She wanted to scream, but only a groan came out of her throat. The crowd was terrified. Some screamed, some filmed everything, but no one came closer. "Let her go!" came a voice, hoarse and full of anger. It was an old man from the back rows. His face was worn by life, but his eyes were blazing. "You are not a man. You are a monster." The officer looked around, narrowing his eyes, as if choosing his next victim. "Shut up, old man," he growled, gritting his teeth. "If you want to join in, go ahead. I don't mind." Emily felt his hand tightening around her hair. Her skin burned with pain. Her body shook, but her mind screamed, "This isn't the end. This can't be the end. I'm the mayor's daughter," she croaked, barely able to speak. Her voice was weak, but not broken. The officer froze for a split second. His eyes gleamed, not with fear, but with malicious satisfaction. "The mayor's daughter?" He pushed her away sharply, so that she fell to the ground again. "What difference does it make? You are the same as everyone else. You are all the same. Your fathers, your mothers, your children are nothing." He raised his club again, preparing to strike. "It's time to teach you who's boss here." Emily crouched low, waiting for the inevitable impact, but at that moment the sound of sirens rang out. Blue lights flashed as they drew nearer, and whispers began to emanate from the crowd. It's the police," someone from the crowd shouted. "The real police." The officer looked back, his face pale. In the distance, police cars were approaching them, and these were not his colleagues. These were forces he had not expected, did not know, those who could stop his madness. What the hell? He walked away from Emily, throwing a displeased glance at the arriving officers. But Emily knew it wasn't over yet. Emily tried to stand, but her legs refused to obey her. Pain coursed through her body, pulsing in time with her pounding heart. It seemed as if reality was dissolving around her. The screams of the crowd, the blue and red flashes of sirens, and the heavy footsteps of the officer who showed no sign of retreating, all of it merged into one murky, terrible whirlwind. The officer, seeing the approaching cars, froze for a moment, but then his face twisted into an unnatural grimace of rage. It seemed as if he was ready to run. But something, perhaps his own hatred, held him in place. He was not finished. He had not yet played enough with his power. With the baton clutched in his hand, he turned back to Emily, an unhealthy glint in his eyes. "You think they'll save you?" he growled, moving closer to her again. "You think your connections or your daddy will help you here?" "No!" His voice grew louder, more and more ferocious. "I'm the law here, and people like you need to be taught on the spot." He hit her again, this time aiming for her back. The pain flared brightly, and Emily couldn't hold back a scream. Her hands tried unsuccessfully to cover themselves, but her strength was fading. The crowd began to move closer, several people shouting protests, but no one dared to rush forward. This man was the epitome of evil to them, and fear paralyzed them all. "Enough!" A female voice came from the crowd. A young girl tried to get closer, but was immediately stopped by other protesters. "He's going to kill her. She's already dead if she doesn't learn her place," the officer shouted, not taking his eyes off Emily. He was enjoying this moment, as if every cry, every tear, every breath only fueled his hatred. "Stop," Emily croaked, her voice barely audible. She tried with all her might to get to her knees, but every movement caused unbearable pain. "What did you say?" The officer leaned over her, his face close, too close. He grabbed her hair, forcing her to look him in the eyes again. "You think you can tell me stop?" His laugh was full of malice. "You're nothing. You're just dirt." His voice was an angry hiss. "I can do whatever I want to you." There was no fear of the law in his eyes, no remorse for what he had done. He seemed to be losing touch with reality, intoxicated by his own power and contempt. There was a stomping of feet nearby. Other police officers had finally arrived on the scene, but the officer continued to stand over Emily like a predator over his prey. "Hey!" One of the arriving policemen shouted at the officer. "What are you doing? Get away from her!" The officer glanced at them, but his hand remained in Emily's hair. His lips were trembling with tension, his face flushed, as if he couldn't believe that anyone had dared to question his actions. "She fought back," he cried, squeezing her hair harder. "The thing fought back. I'm just doing my job." "Let her go! Immediately!" they shouted again. One of the officers who had arrived came closer, his face distorted with alarm. "That's an order!" The racist officer growled, but slowly released his grip on Emily. She collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with pain, her breathing ragged. It seemed to her that the world around her was blurring, that sounds were fading into nothingness, but his gaze was still before her eyes, full of hatred and contempt. "You didn't win," he hissed, stepping away but still looking at her as if she was still his prey. "You're no one. You're nothing." The crowd finally came to life. People moved forward. Some tried to help Emily. Some screamed at the officer, demanding his immediate arrest. Camera phones were trained on him, recording every second of his crime. "She's a victim," one protester shouted. "This is an assault. He should be arrested." However, the officer only grinned, looking defiantly at everyone around him. "Who are you?" His voice broke through the shouts of the crowd again. "You are all nothing. The police are standing above you. Nothing will change. Do you think your rallies will change anything? Fools!" Emily tried to push herself up on her elbows, but the pain lanced through her again. She felt several people leaning over her, helping her up. Her face was wet with tears, but it wasn't just pain. There was something deeper, more painful, a sense of absolute injustice, a sense that even now, when everyone had seen what had happened, this man, this monster, could get away with it. "You will answer for this," she whispered, no longer able to contain her anger. "Everyone will see who you are." The officer grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light of the street lamps. "Let them look," he said, without looking away. "I'm not afraid of you." The crowd seemed to freeze, as if the world had stopped for a moment, waiting for the next move. Emily, shaking with pain and fear, tried to stay on her feet. She felt the support of the people trying to lift her up, but she knew this officer would not stop. His rage was not yet spent. Even now, when other police officers appeared on the scene, he looked at her as if her life meant nothing. "You think it's over?" His voice cut through the air, filled with anxiety and tension. His eyes glittered like a predator who wasn't satisfied with his prey. He took a step forward, and even the other officers froze, unsure of what to do. "You think I'll be afraid of a few cameras and complaints?" He chuckled, though there was no joy in his smile. "Only cruelty. The laws are on our side, and people like you will always be underfoot." The crowd began to stir again, shouting, "Arrest him!" and "Where is justice?" But the officer remained standing, his hands clenched into fists, as if he were ready to strike again at any moment. His baton gleamed in the dim light of the street lamps, ready for another blow. "Let her go!" shouted one of the protesters, a young man wearing a t-shirt that read "Justice for All." He stepped forward, but stopped short when the officer made a sharp move toward him, raising his baton threateningly. "Who's next?" the officer hissed, looking at everyone with an expression of hatred. "Who else wants to get what they deserve?" Emily looked up at him, shaking. Her mind was racing. How could this be happening right in front of everyone? Why couldn't anyone stop him? But worst of all was this overwhelming fear, not for herself, but for those around her. The officer was dangerous, and she felt like one more word, one more move, and he would attack again. You will answer for this," she croaked, feeling her voice struggling to break through the tears and pain. "Everyone can see what you did." The officer leaned closer, his face contorted with disdain. "No one is coming for you," he whispered, and his words hit her like a knife. "No one is coming for you, for all of you, because your kind will always be at the bottom." He raised his club as if he was going to strike again, and Emily closed her eyes, bracing herself for another wave of pain. But then her voice broke through, louder than she expected. "I'm the mayor's daughter," she screamed, at the top of her lungs. Her words echoed down the street, and the crowd froze. All eyes were on her. The officer paused for a moment, his face contorted in a mixture of surprise and contempt. "The mayor's daughter?" he repeated, his voice full of mockery. "You think that changes anything? You think your father will save you?" His laugh was evil, twisted, as if he were laughing not at her words but at the very concept of justice. "Mayor or not, you're nothing to me." His hand came up with the baton again, and Emily knew he wasn't going to stop. In that moment, she felt like her status didn't matter here on this street. She was just a black woman who dared to stand up to the system, and she was going to face a cruel reckoning for it. The crowd around her grew increasingly restless. People were screaming, trying to push forward to protect her, but fear of the officer, of his power, paralyzed them. Some were crying, filming everything on their phones, hoping that this would be proof of his crimes. But at this moment, nothing could stop him. "Let her go," another woman from the crowd shouted, her voice full of despair. "You have no right." "I am the law," the officer shouted, his eyes blazing with madness, "and I decide what is right." He took a step toward Emily and swung, but immediately felt resistance. Someone from the crowd, unable to bear it, rushed at him, trying to stop him. It was the same young man who had been shouting for justice a few minutes ago. He grabbed the officer's arm, trying to pull the baton away. "No!" the young man screamed, his face distorted with rage and fear. "You wouldn't dare." The officer spun around, pushing him away with such force that the boy fell to the ground, hitting the concrete. His baton flashed in the air again, ready to strike the young man, but another officer, one of the later arrivals, finally intervened. "Stop!" His voice was full of authority, and it was an order that could not be ignored. "You have crossed the line." The racist officer froze for a moment, his face contorting again, this time with rage at his own colleagues. "Are you betraying me?" he yelled, stepping back. She should have gotten hers. They should all know their place. But another officer grabbed his arm, preventing him from hitting Emily or anyone else. "You're under arrest," he said quietly but confidently, his eyes flashing with menace. "For assault, for abuse of power. This is the end." The officer tried to break free, his rage like that of a wild animal cornered. "I won't let you stop me," he shouted, but more police grabbed him and the crowd exploded with applause, tears and cries of relief. Emily finally felt her body relax, but she was afraid, not for herself, but for everyone else. The officer had been taken away, but his words, his hatred, would stay with her forever, and she knew this fight was far from over. The officer didn't give up, even as his colleagues surrounded him. As the crowd began to applaud in relief, his eyes continued to burn with rage. He tore himself away from the officers and rushed toward Emily again, as if he couldn't allow her to remain unharmed after all he had done. His hatred was absolute, as if her existence were an insult to his very being. "You're not getting away," he shouted, his voice carried over the noise of the crowd. He still had the baton in his hand, and he swung it with such force that even the other officers froze for a moment, unable to react. Emily felt fear grip her body again. He wouldn't stop. He was coming for her again, like a predator who already tasted blood. The crowd froze. Someone shouted, "Stop him!" But no one moved fast enough. Everyone was stunned by his audacity and cruelty. "You think you're something special?" The officer was very close. His voice was full of malice and contempt, and his words sounded like poison, slowly eating away at any sense of security. "You and all these people are just trash, and I will make sure that everyone understands that." His club flashed through the air, and Emily instinctively covered herself with her hands, expecting another blow. In that moment, it seemed to her that time slowed down. She saw his eyes glitter in the cold light of the street lamps, saw his hand move towards her. Every moment was filled with terror. "You're not leaving here just like that," he hissed through clenched teeth. "No one will save you. Not your father. Not this crowd. I'll smash you into the asphalt so you'll remember your place." But at the last moment, another officer, a young man with a tense expression on his face, managed to grab his colleague's hand, interrupting his movement. "Stop it!" he shouted, holding the baton. His voice shook with a mixture of fear and determination. "You're crazy!" The officer, the racist, let out a strangled growl, jerking violently, trying to break free. His face turned purple, and his gaze became even more hateful. "You don't understand," he shouted, looking the young policeman in the eye. "They deserved it. She deserved it." The crowd began to move closer, surrounding them in a tight circle. People were filming everything on cameras, shouting threats and demands for an arrest. But Emily felt how this man, despite the surrounding and resistance, still held power over the situation. His hatred was so deep that he did not need any reason or justification. He just wanted to destroy her. "You will remember this," he hissed, looking at Emily again, his voice almost a whisper, but there was a threat in it. "Wherever you are, whoever you are, I will find you, and then no one will be able to protect you." His eyes bored into her, full of hatred and determination. Even when his colleagues finally grabbed his arms, taking the baton away and twisting them behind his back, he continued to look at her as if nothing could stop him, as if he was willing to sacrifice everything to hurt her. "It'll be different when all these cameras turn off." His voice was getting quieter, but his words cut deep, like a cold knife. "I'll get to you, and then we'll finish this for real." Emily stood there, her fists clenched, her body shaking with fear and rage. But even now, with him gone, with the danger seemingly over, she knew it wasn't over. His words echoed in her head. It wasn't just a fit of anger, it was a real threat, and she knew this man would do anything to carry it out. "He can't hurt you anymore," said one of the officers who came up to her. He tried to smile, but his face was tense. "We saw everything. He will answer for this." But Emily couldn't believe it. She knew that people like him were protected by the system. How many times had this happened? How many times had black people been humiliated, beaten, and then brushed over as if nothing had happened? "We will take care of you," the officer added, but his voice seemed as fragile as the promise of justice. Emily, shaking, tried to comprehend what had happened. The officer had been taken away, but his threat remained, and she knew the nightmare was not over. The officer broke free from his colleague's grasp, his eyes meeting Emily's again. He looked as if his rage had reached its peak, as if all he wanted was to finish what he had started. Even with his hands pinned behind his back, he continued to shout threats aimed straight at her soul, never taking his eyes off her trembling form. "You think this is the end?" His voice thundered through the chaos of screams and sirens. The crowd recoiled, scared by the sudden outburst of hatred. "You think anyone will protect you? I will get you. Do you hear me? I will crush you. I will find you, even if it is my last day on this damn earth." Emily felt her legs give way, and her mind barely kept from panicking. She had never encountered such naked hatred in her life. Yes, she knew about racism, about injustice, but now this evil had a face. The face of this cop, who embodied everything that was worst imaginable. This was not just aggression, this was a hunt. He pulled his hand out of the other policeman's grip as he tried to calm him down. At that moment, his gaze was fixed only on Emily, as if nothing and no one else existed in the world but her. "Look at me," he shouted, waving his club in her direction. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." He moved forward, his steps full of determination and malice. The other officers tried to stop him, but he kept struggling, like a wounded animal, ready to attack again and again. Emily felt her hands instinctively rise to cover her head. It wasn't a conscious gesture, just her body trying to protect itself. "Do you think I'm afraid of your father? Your friends?" His voice cut through the silence, filling the street with a cold threat. "They are all nothing. You are nothing, and I will prove it to you." He swung his baton again, and the people around him gasped in fear. Someone from the crowd tried to come closer, but the officer turned sharply, pointing his baton at these people. "Get back," he shouted, blinded by his own rage. "If any of you move, you'll get what she got." His baton flashed in the dim light, hanging menacingly in the air. It was as if he was enjoying the crowd retreating, the way people froze under his threats. Emily stood there, gritting her teeth, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. "What will you do when the cameras turn off?" the officer continued, his voice quieter but no less threatening. He slowly approached Emily, his eyes glowing with an evil light. "What will you do when all these pathetic people go home? Then who will save you? You will beg me for mercy, but I will not stop." He came very close, and his words, full of hatred, penetrated her consciousness like poison. "I will find you, even if I have to search every corner of this city," he hissed, "and I will make you remember every word you have ever spoken here. You and your kind have always been and will always be under my boot." At that moment, Emily realized that he wasn't just threatening. This was a real promised nightmare. Every word, every gesture was filled with contempt and a desire to destroy her life, to destroy her personality. The crowd began to shout again, demanding his arrest, but their voices seemed distant. All she could hear was his hissing and his club swinging menacingly before her eyes. "You won't be anyone anymore," he whispered, his face leaning closer. "I'll make you forgotten. You'll just disappear." The officer broke free of his colleague's grasp again with a fury that seemed almost unreal. His eyes were full of hatred, and in that moment, all of his anger was focused on Emily. He no longer paid attention to the screams of the crowd or the cameras that continued to record every second of what was happening. There was nothing in his mind except the desire to destroy her. "I said you're not going anywhere." His voice cut through the air like a blade. He rushed towards Emily with the baton, holding it in his hand like a deadly weapon. The crowd around screamed. People retreated. Someone tried to get closer to stop him, but it was too late. The first blow was sudden and sharp. The club hit her shoulder with a dull thud, and Emily cried out in pain. She fell to the ground, her legs buckling, her head spinning. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. She saw the club rise into the air again, but she did not have time to defend herself. "That's it," the officer growled, delivering another blow, aiming for her side, his face twisted in satisfied cruelty. "See, this is your place." Each blow was like a clap of thunder, and each time the pain became more and more unbearable. Emily tried to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the wave of pain that engulfed her entire body. She tried to rise, but the officer kicked her legs again, causing her to fall back onto the cold asphalt. "You're not fit to even stand on these streets," he shouted, his club flashing in the dim light of the street lamps as he struck one blow after another. It was as if he couldn't stop. His face was twisted with an evil satisfaction, as if he was enjoying every moment. The crowd screamed. People tried to break through, but other officers held them back, creating a human wall between them and the violence. Some desperately filmed the violence, hoping it would be proof that the world would see the brutality. But for Emily, that world was reduced to one man, the officer who continued to beat her as if she were the embodiment of everything he hated. "You're a nobody," he continued, his voice shaking with rage. "People like you will always be suppressed. You'll always be on your knees. Do you hear me?" He swung again, aiming the club at her back, and Emily felt the pain shoot through her body, leaving behind fire and despair. She couldn't move anymore. Her body refused to obey. She just closed her eyes, feeling the tears running down her cheeks, and hoped that it would all end soon. But the officer did not stop. He raised his baton again and again, his blows becoming more and more chaotic and vicious. It was as if he had completely lost touch with reality. His only goal was destruction. "You should have known your place," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "I'll show you who's boss." His baton came down again, but at that moment someone from the crowd, breaking through the police cordon, rushed at him. It was the young man who had earlier tried to protect Emily. He grabbed the officer by the arm, pushing him away from the beaten woman. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice full of despair. "You'll kill her." The officer froze for a moment, but there was still that same hatred in his eyes. He spun around and punched the boy hard, knocking him off his feet. The young man fell to the ground next to Emily, and the officer raised his baton again, preparing to hit him. "Don't interfere," he shouted, but at that moment he was finally subdued by other police officers. Two officers threw him to the ground, taking away his baton and tying his hands behind his back. The crowd erupted in shouts, some crying, some shouting threats at the officer, but the worst had already happened. Emily lay on the ground, her body shaking with pain and shock. She was breathing hard, trying to comprehend that it was all over, but the officer's words still echoed in her head. His blows would be felt in every breath for a long time to come. "We saved you," someone who came up to her said, but his voice seemed far away. Emily couldn't believe that this was really the end. The officers who had just subdued their enraged colleague looked lost. Their faces were tense, but they did not show the determination that was needed. The crowd was still screaming, shouting curses and demands for justice, but the noise in Emily's head had merged into one continuous hum. Everything around her was slowly drowning in a gray fog of pain and fear. She tried to get up, but her body refused to obey her. Every movement caused a sharp pain, as if her bones had cracked and now there were only fragments under the skin. Blood ran down her face, getting into her eyes, turning the world into an even more blurry and chaotic spot. Meanwhile, the officer who had been captured did not calm down. He continued to scream, twisting like a caged animal while they held him by the arms. "Let me go!" His voice broke into screams and curses. "I'm not done yet. She must pay for this." He struggled to break free, and his rage knew no bounds. His colleagues were confused. One of them quietly said to the other, "What should we do? He's just gone crazy." "Don't interfere," he shouted, looking at them with hatred. "I know what I'm doing. She has no right to walk these streets. She has no right to be here." His voice was filled with such venom that those around him froze. This was not just a man following orders. This was a creature consumed by his hatred, his rage making him something inhuman. The crowd began to gather closer again. People could no longer watch in silence. Several people shouted threats at the officer. Someone threw a bottle that broke next to him, but no one dared to come closer, fearing that the chaos would get out of control again. "You are all nothing here," he continued to scream, writhing in the arms of his colleagues. His voice sounded like a terrible omen. "Each of you, and those like her, will know their place." Emily tried to speak, but her voice was drowned in pain and weakness. She saw his eyes, still fixed on her, full of hatred and the desire to destroy. Even when he was held down, even when he could no longer strike her, she felt his malice seeping into her, like something dark and unforgiving. Suddenly the officer broke free. No one understood how he did it. With one jerk he freed himself from the hands of his colleagues, and the baton was in his hands again. It happened so quickly that no one had time to react. "You're not getting away," he screamed again, rushing towards Emily like a bullet. People screamed in terror, but their screams mixed with her own scream, which came from her dry throat. She tried to retreat, but her body was too weak. His club came down again, and her world was filled with excruciating pain. The blow hit her arm, and she heard her bones crunch. The pain was so intense that her vision blurred, but she could still hear his angry cries. "You will learn. You will never dare to challenge again." His blows were getting stronger. "I will show you who is the boss here. I will teach you respect." People around tried to break through. Some even rushed to the officer, but they were stopped by his colleagues, creating a barrier of their bodies. But they no longer believed that they could stop him. Each blow was like a hammer, destroying not only her body but her soul as well. Her world was turning into darkness. She could no longer resist. Her body was like a helpless doll being thrown from side to side. "I'll crush you," he shouted, and there was nothing human in his voice. "You'll understand who's boss here." His baton came up again, this time aimed at her head, but before the blow could land, someone in the crowd finally got to him. A hand grabbed his baton and there was a sharp shove. The officer was knocked off his feet, his blow finally broken. People were screaming all around, and it seemed as if the crowd was about to explode. The officer was thrown to the ground, but his rage did not subside. He was still rushing forward, trying to break free from the hands of the people who were holding him. Emily lay on the ground, her body a wreck, her mind swimming in pain and fear. She heard someone calling for an ambulance, someone screaming that they couldn't wait, that she might die, but it was all a blur to her. She felt like her world was crumbling, that every breath was a struggle, and that this nightmare might not stop. "You won't get away from me," the officer shouted, his voice still full of hatred, but he was being held too tightly. "I'll find you. I'll find you." Emily lay on the ground, feeling her body continue to shake in pain, and the world around her was blurring into a shapeless blur. The screams and noises seemed distant, as if everything that was happening was not here, but somewhere far away. But the officer's hatred still rang in her ears, piercing her consciousness like pain. The officer was still being held, but his rage had not abated. He writhed in the arms of his colleagues like a wild animal, and continued to shout threats. His voice was full of promises of revenge, and every word left scars in her soul. "You will not leave me," he shouted again, his eyes burning like two sparks of rage. Do you think this will end? I will make sure you remember this for the rest of your life. You and your noble friends." He continued to growl hysterically, and there was a hatred in his voice that Emily couldn't understand. He wasn't just insulting her, he hated her existence. He hated everything she represented, and every blow was laced with that hatred. Meanwhile, the people around began to gather around, and fear began to fill the space. Some did not have the courage to come closer, but others still tried to take a step forward, wanting to stop this insane cruelty, but their movements were slow and hesitant, as if they were afraid that the officer would turn around and attack them. "You shouldn't interfere," growled one of the officers, holding him down as someone tried to approach. "You don't know what he's capable of." And Emily realized that this wasn't just an incident, this was a war she hadn't signed up for. She never thought she'd find herself in a situation like this, that her life would become an arena of hatred where she was nothing more than a target. Her shoulder was swelling from the blow and her head was spinning. Emily tried to breathe, but every movement brought new waves of pain. She couldn't even look at her rescuers. Their faces were indistinguishable to her. Her thoughts were confused in the abyss of fear and helplessness. Suddenly the officer broke free of his colleague's grasp again, his face contorted with anger. He turned his gaze to Emily, and his eyes lit up as if he had just seen his victim. "Do you think I won't find you?" His voice was low and menacing. "You must know, you can't hide. I will find you, wherever you are, and then I will finish what I started." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart began to beat faster, as if she was about to die. She looked at her hands, which were shaking, and knew that she could not fight any longer. The crowd around her was screaming, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. All she knew was that this man was full of hatred, and his words were a curse that would never leave her. "I can't do this anymore," she screamed, her voice breaking with fear. "Please stop." But his laugh was mad and cruel. He took another step towards her, and Emily realized that she didn't have the strength to run away. She was left lying on the pavement, full of fear and despair, as if her whole life had shrunk in that moment. "You will not leave until I decide this," he said, raising the club again, and at that moment everything around her disappeared, leaving only darkness and the anticipation of pain. The blow landed on her back and she screamed, feeling her body constrict in endless pain again. Each blow was like a thunderclap, each sound a cry from her soul. "You have no right to live," he continued, his voice sounding like an echo of hell. "I will teach you respect. I will make you an example for everyone." Emily felt the world around her crumble again. This wasn't just physical violence, it was an attack on her identity, on her being. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her soul. "No, no, no!" Her cries mingled with the buzz of the crowd. "Please, no!" But there was no pity in his eyes. He kept hitting her, and with each blow her hope for salvation disappeared. She felt her body becoming weaker, everything around her sinking into a black abyss. The crowd became more aggressive. Some people threw things at the officer, but their shouts only fueled his hatred. He closed his eyes in rage, and in that moment Emily realized her life had become his game, and her suffering his triumph. "I'll make you forget what freedom is," he shouted, his voice breaking into a scream. "You'll be afraid to even breathe." A fire of fear flared in her mind. She tried to cover her ears, but it didn't help. Every sound was like the last chord of her pain, and every blow left scars not only on her body, but on her soul. She knew that this was not just an attack. This was an attempt to break her, an attempt to destroy her. And at that moment, when she felt that she could not bear it any longer, a spark awoke in her consciousness, a spark that told her that she had to fight. Even if it was her last fight, she had to try. "I won't give in," she growled, her voice cutting through the cloud of fear. She felt a fire blazing inside her. "I won't let you break me." That spark, that confidence, suddenly made her stronger. She didn't know how it happened, but now, as she lay on the ground, her eyes met the officers, and there was no fear in them, only determination. "You will not take my life from me," she screamed, her voice full of rage. Emily felt her body begin to move again, the pain becoming her fuel. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: her suffering would not be in vain, and she would not let this monster win. Emily felt her resolve grow, but she was also afraid. Every blow left invisible wounds on her body, but her spirit was not going to give in. She raised her head, and in the officer's eyes she read not just hatred, but also confidence in her impunity. This man believed that his actions would never be punished, that no one could stop him. "You think this will end?" he growled, approaching again, and at that moment her heart stopped. Every step he took sounded like a harbinger of new horror. "I won't let you break me," she repeated, her voice, though hoarse, sounding with new strength, but inside her, not only fear, but anger was growing. Emily gathered the last of her strength, knowing that her life was hanging by a thread. The crowd around her continued to scream, but their cries began to be drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. She felt her head spinning, as the loss and suffering began to consume her. Every time she tried to rise, the pain pierced her like sharp needles. The officer raised his baton again, and dark sparks flashed in his eyes. He knew he had power, and this only fueled his rage. Raising his baton, he growled again, "You shouldn't have stood in my way. You and your brothers in arms. I'll make sure everyone knows that you don't matter." In that moment, Emily realized that this wasn't just a fight between her and him. This was a fight for every black woman and man, for every person who had ever felt the weight of hatred. She gathered all the strength she had, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for what might be the last moment of her life. "I will not be your victim," she screamed, her voice cutting through the fear. But his rage only grew. He stepped closer, and in that moment, understanding appeared in her eyes that she could not save herself unless she acted. She had to show that she was alive, that her existence mattered. But how? Suddenly, from the background, one of the spectators in the crowd, a middle-aged man with a determined expression on his face, rushed forward, boldly pushing his way toward Emily and the officer. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice like a bolt from the blue. "You have no right to do this." But the officer just chuckled, ignoring the interruption. He turned around, intending to strike again, and at that moment Emily felt fear wash over her. She knew that this could be her last chance. A thought flashed through her mind about her family, about all those who loved her, about her dreams and hopes. "Help!" she screamed, her voice full of despair. "Please stop him!" The crowd froze, but the men did not retreat. At this time, the officer again pointed his baton in her direction, his rage intensifying. "You are nothing," he growled, and again his blow landed on her body. This time it hit her ribs, and Emily felt something crunch, and then the darkness began to slowly envelop her. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the blood. She tried to raise her hand to cover herself, but her strength left her. Everything was getting dark in her eyes, and every moment it was becoming more and more difficult to breathe. "Don't let him break you," the man shouted, but his words no longer reached her consciousness. She no longer heard the shouts of the crowd, or her own name. All that remained was the endless darkness that was drawing her in. At that moment, the officer, seeing her lifeless body, raised his head to the crowd, and a grin spread across his lips. "Look at her! She thought she could fight, and now she's just another victim." His voice was full of malice. "No one can save her." Laughter, full of bitterness and malice, echoed in her ears, but Emily could not fight anymore. She knew that she should have fought, but now her strength left her. Her consciousness began to dissolve, and her body sank into deep darkness. She felt her thoughts leaving, her dreams crumbling into small pieces, and her life fading into darkness. And at that moment, when she thought that all was lost, another person came out of the crowd, a woman, with courage in her eyes. She broke away from the crowd and, ignoring the officer, rushed towards Emily. Her arms hugged her tightly, but Emily could not respond. She simply closed her eyes, hoping that her dreams of freedom would come true. "You're not alone," the woman screamed, her voice like a beacon of salvation. "We're with you. We won't let this happen." But the officer squared his shoulders and raised his baton again, as if he was ready to deliver the final blow. Hatred was blazing in his eyes, and he knew his moment had come. He wanted to break Emily completely, wanted to bring her to the very bottom, to show everyone that hatred always wins. But Emily, even in the darkness, suddenly felt her heart beating faster. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: this fight was not only hers, but everyone who had ever suffered from hatred. She knew that in every blow of her hatred there were people who were not going to give in. With that thought in mind, she gathered her strength and, taking a deep breath, decided that she would not allow herself to give in. "I'm alive," she roared, her voice like thunder. "I won't give up." That spark inside her flared up again, and she knew that even if the darkness was coming, she would not be alone. The darkness Emily had fallen into suddenly began to clear as her consciousness was filled with loud screams. She felt a warm hand holding her tightly, not allowing her to fall into the endless darkness. It was the same woman who had tried to save her, but even in this moment, where light was breaking through the darkness, fear did not leave her. The officer, noticing someone trying to help Emily, turned to face the new threat. His eyes lit up with rage. He glared at the woman, and in that moment Emily felt like she had to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been the victim of hatred. "You think you can stop me?" he growled, his voice filled with all the heartless fury in the world. "I'll teach you both respect." The woman who had Emily in her arms held her as tightly as she could, as if their bond could give her strength. She looked into Emily's eyes, and there was so much determination in them. "We're together," she shouted. "We won't let him do this." It was a call to action. Emily felt hope begin to flare up inside her, and even though her body was wounded, a fighting spirit was forged inside her. "You can't break us," Emily screamed, a new strength in her voice. "We won't stay silent. We'll fight." The officer paused for a moment, surprised by her sudden determination. This was not the weak victim he had expected, but his anger only grew. He raised his baton again, and her shadow loomed over them like a threat, ready to knock them off their feet. "I'll shut your mouths once and for all," he growled, waving his club. But the crowd, emboldened, began to move forward. Their cries grew louder, and they seemed to finally understand that their silence was what had allowed this nightmare to continue. "No!" shouted the same man who had tried to protect Emily earlier. "We will not allow this madness to continue." He stepped forward, and others followed. Women, men, young, old, they all began to surround the officer, creating a ring of defiance around him. Emily felt her own strength grow as she saw their voices ring out as one. The officer, realizing that his power was beginning to melt away, cried out in rage. He began to thrash about desperately, like a cornered animal. "Get out of my way," he growled, his voice shaking with furious anger. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." But the screams of the crowd did not subside. They grew louder and louder, and in this chaos Emily felt her fear begin to leave her. "We're not afraid of you," she screamed, rising to her feet despite the pain that pierced her body. "We're together, and that makes us stronger." The crowd cheered her on again. Emily felt a fire burning inside her, a fire that radiated hope and strength. Every person standing next to her gave her confidence. She knew that this was their fight, and that her suffering had not been in vain. The officer raised his baton, but at that moment the crowd moved forward. They were ready to protect each other, and their unity was stronger than any violence. With horror in his eyes, he realized that they were no longer just bystanders, they were part of the struggle. "Get out!" he shouted again, but his voice was losing its power. There was a sound of footsteps behind her as other police officers, hearing the screams, began to approach, but Emily couldn't wait for them to come to her aid. "We won't wait for anyone else to come to our aid," she shouted, her voice full of confidence and determination. "We'll protect ourselves." The crowd, carried away by her energy, moved forward, and Emily, her heart pounding like never before. She knew this battle would not end now, but they had already made the first move. She was ready to fight, and there was a fire in her eyes. "We will stand to the end," she shouted, and the crowd supported her, their voices merging into a powerful chorus of resistance. At that moment, the officer finally realized that his plan had failed. He glanced at the crowd, then at Emily, and her certainty was reflected in his eyes like an inescapable truth. He no longer had power. He retreated, intending to go to safety, but this was more than a defeat, it was a shameful victory for anyone who had ever suffered hatred. Suddenly, sirens began to sound and more police arrived on the scene. Emily and the crowd felt new people entering the conflict, and fear washed over them again, but it was no longer an overwhelming fear, it was a driving force. "We are on the side of justice," someone from the crowd shouted, and the thought was transmitted to everyone. The officers, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, began to take action, but instead of dispersing the crowd, they saw that their brothers in service had lost control of the situation. "Get him out of here," the woman hugging Emily screamed, pointing at the policeman who was still threatening her. "He has no right to stay here." And then, as if on cue, the crowd began to move forward, surrounding the officer who was ready for the final blow. Emily felt her heart fill with hope again. This was not just a fight, this was a fight for every life. for every soul that was being destroyed. At that moment, Emily realized that she was not alone, and that the fight for justice continued. Together, they were stronger than any violence, and this hatred could not break them. The officer, realizing that his hatred and cruelty meant nothing in the face of unity and love, lowered his head and stepped back. He knew he had lost. In this difficult moment, when the world began to fall apart again, Emily raised her head. She knew that there would be much more fighting ahead, but now she was not afraid. She was ready to fight, and her heart beat in unison with the hearts of all those around her. "We will win," she shouted, her voice a hymn of hope. "We will not stop until hatred is defeated." The crowd roared in response, and in that moment Emily realized this wasn't just her fight. This was a fight for everyone who had ever felt oppression, for those who could no longer remain silent, for those who dreamed of freedom. There was more fighting ahead, but she was ready. Emily stood in the center of the heated crowd, her heart still pounding, but now there was something more to it than just rage. Confidence. Every shouted phrase, every movement around her reminded her that they were all united in a single purpose. She was part of something greater than her own suffering. The officer, realizing that his attempts at intimidation had failed, froze in place, as if surrounded by a storm. He took a step back, and the crowd, sensing this, took courage. People began to move toward him, not to attack, but to show solidarity. They stood in front of Emily like a shield, ready to protect her. "You're not alone, Emily," cried the same woman who had hugged her earlier. "We're with you." The crowd responded with a shout that sounded like thunder, and it inspired Emily. She felt her strength growing, the confidence she had been searching for so long returning to her. Every shout, every word lifted her spirit. "Get him out," the same man who had first spoken up for Emily shouted. His voice was so loud that even the officer couldn't ignore it. "We're going to stand here until he goes away." Emily looked up to see other people starting to step forward as well, forming a human wall against the officer. She felt hope rise in her chest. Even with her injuries, she knew the power of this crowd was greater than anything hatred could do. The officer suddenly felt vulnerable, as if the forces he had always considered immutable were beginning to leave him. He looked at the faces of the people who were looking at him with hatred and contempt. Panic flashed in his eyes. "I'm not afraid of you," he growled, but his voice was no longer so confident. "I'll make you pay for this." But instead of the fear he expected, the crowd responded with laughter and jeers. It wasn't just a reaction, it was an understanding that they were stronger than his threats. "We won't give in to your threats," Emily screamed, her voice a call to action. "We'll stand here until you leave." The crowd had once again supported her, and this was no longer just an empty promise. They were ready to fight for every life, every soul, every heart that had ever suffered from hatred. The officer, realizing that his strength was beginning to fade, stepped back in confusion. "I'll call for reinforcements," he shouted, but there was no longer any confidence in his voice. "Let them come," someone from the crowd shouted. "We won't be afraid." Emily felt the adrenaline rush through her veins. She knew this was her moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. Each of them was willing to stand until the end, and that gave her strength. In that moment, she realized that her voice was not just a scream, but a symbol of resistance. "We fight for justice," she shouted again. "We demand respect." The officer, realizing that his power and control over the situation was being destroyed, began to panic. He no longer saw before him those whom he considered victims. He saw people who had united for one purpose. At this point, he began to retreat, his confidence beginning to disappear like fog in the sun. "Get out of here," he growled, but his words no longer sounded so menacing. "I'm not joking. You have no power here," shouted one of the men standing in the front row. "We will decide what to do." Emily noticed other people starting to arrive at the scene. They were activists, ready to support her in the crowd. They lined up, holding out their hands in support, and it felt like a surge of hope. Each new person who came gave her confidence. "We are here to protect everyone's rights," one of the activists shouted, raising a flag that symbolized the fight for equality. The flag unfurled in the wind, and a spark lit up Emily's eyes. More and more people joined them, and Emily realized that they could change the course of events. She looked at the officer, who was still shaking with rage and fear, and took a step forward. "You can't silence us," she screamed. "We're here to stay." With every word she spoke, she felt the power of her voice grow stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever faced the same thing. Every blow she had endured became part of her strength. The forces that had come in support began to cut through the air, and at that moment the officer finally realized that his time was up. He quickly looked around at the people surrounding him, and fear was reflected in his eyes. "Leave while you can," he growled, but now his words sounded like a request, not a threat. Emily looked out at the crowd and a sense of unity blossomed in her heart. This was the moment when hatred began to give way to love and solidarity. She knew they had to act and that this was their last chance to get justice. "We're not leaving," she cried, and the crowd echoed her words. "We'll fight for what's right." And in that moment, Emily felt her spirit fill with new strength. She raised her hands in a sign of unity, and the others followed suit. They became a human shield, protecting each other, standing on the edge to show that hatred cannot win. With all their forces combined, Emily knew they were capable of more than just resistance. This was an opportunity to change the situation, and she was ready to fight until her last breath. The crowd that surrounded Emily was like a stormy sea, ready to break through any barriers. Every new cry, every movement filled her with determination, and in that moment, she remembered who she was. She wasn't just a woman who had suffered abuse. She was the mayor's daughter, a symbol of hope for her city, and her voice could be heard. She took a deep breath, realizing that her position gave her the opportunity to change the course of events not only for herself, but for many others. "I'm not just an ordinary woman," she shouted, addressing everyone present, and her voice, although trembling with emotion, was full of strength. "I'm the daughter of the mayor of this city. I'm here to say that we will not tolerate violence and racism." The crowd responded to her words with a loud cheer, and at that moment she felt the power of unity wash over her again. She raised her hands, calling for everyone to be silent, and they responded eagerly. "We're all here for the same thing," she continued, her voice even more confident. "We want our voices heard. We demand justice, and I will stand by this side until I make a difference." The officer standing before them felt his grip on the situation slip completely. He looked at Emily, his hatred now seeming pointless. He couldn't resist this wave of unity, and it was perhaps the greatest threat he had ever faced. "You're just a little girl playing politics," he growled, but his voice no longer sounded confident. Emily looked into his eyes, ignoring the fear that had once plagued her. There was determination in her gaze. "I may be the mayor's daughter, but I am also a representative of each and every one of you. I am not alone," she replied, pointing to the people standing behind her. "We are all in this fight together, and we will not back down." The crowd began to scream again, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. It sounded like not just a protest, but a revolution. Emily felt a surge of strength and confidence building in her chest, and that energy was transmitted to everyone around her. "We are here to support each other," she cried. "We will not let you intimidate us or crush our dreams of a just world." The officer began to lose his confidence little by little. Activists gathered around him, ready to support Emily. Everyone who came to this rally stood shoulder to shoulder, and they were united by one common idea: justice. "You can't break us," someone from the crowd shouted, and Emily felt it resonate inside her. "Each of us is important," added another woman. "We are strong, and we will fight to the end." The words these people spoke penetrated Emily's very soul. She knew that her voice was not just a cry, but a symbol of hope for everyone who had ever suffered from oppression. The officer, retreating, felt that his threat no longer had any force. He saw how the crowd united around Emily became more and more determined. Every step he took him further from power, and finally he could not stay any longer. "I'm calling for reinforcements," he shouted again, but his voice was now only a faint whisper. Emily felt a fire ignite inside her. She knew that her father, the mayor, supported the fight for justice, and she was not about to drag his name through the mud. She was more than just the mayor's daughter. She was the voice of a generation that wanted change. "We won't wait for them to come," she shouted, raising her fist in solidarity. "We'll make the change ourselves." The crowd responded to her words again, and her spirit grew. People began to rise, creating a barrier between Emily and the officer. They stood before her, ready to defend not only her, but all of her ideals. Emily felt her strength grow, and she decided that they could do this together. "We are our future," she shouted, to a roar of approval. "We can achieve justice if we work together." This fight was just beginning, and Emily knew they had every chance to turn things around. With each new cry, they grew stronger, and a fire lit in their hearts. This wasn't just a fight for her anymore, it was a fight for everyone who had ever felt oppressed and forgotten. The officer, realizing his time was running out, was in a panic, but instead of breaking Emily and the crowd, he only became a testament to the strength of their unity. Emily felt like she had taken a stand for truth and justice, and that journey was just beginning. Emily watched the officer retreat further and further, and a fire of determination ignited in her heart. She understood that this was her chance, the moment when she could not only defend her rights, but also show everyone that hatred cannot go unpunished. This story must end with justice. The crowd continued to cheer her on, and each new cry gave her strength. Emily knew that as the mayor's daughter, she had access to resources that could change everything, but before she could think about what to do next, she needed to stop the officer from hurting anyone else. "Do you think your threats will frighten us?" she screamed, giving her voice all the force she could muster. "We will not remain silent any longer." The officer, realizing that his power was fading, tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He glanced nervously at the crowd, which was becoming more determined and furious with each passing moment. "You will be held accountable for your actions," Emily said, feeling a surge of confidence wash over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for those who had experienced the horrors of racism and violence. "I will make sure you pay for what you did." Emily thought of her mother, who always taught her that justice could be achieved if one had enough courage and determination. She knew that she was not alone and that there were many people willing to support her in this fight. Gathering all her thoughts, she took a step forward, towards the officer. Suddenly, she remembered the phone that was in her pocket. She took it out and quickly began recording a video, addressing everyone nearby. "I'm here to prove that we will not remain silent," she said, pointing the camera at the officer. "This man who beat me and threatened me needs to know that we know his name and his actions. We will not forget this." The officer, seeing her words being recorded, felt fear fill him again. He knew that this could backfire on him, and his panic increased. "You can't do this," he shouted, but his voice was weak and unconvincing. "It's wrong." "Wrong?" Emily asked furiously. "What you did to me and so many others is wrong. You must answer for it, and I will do everything in my power to make it happen." The crowd around her screamed in support, and Emily felt the energy grow. She knew that her video would be an important tool they could use to fight hatred and injustice. Emily finished recording and wasted no time in posting the video on social media. She knew it would generate a wave of support and help build evidence against the officer. People began commenting and sharing her video, and it soon went viral. "We stand with Emily," people wrote from all over the country, and it filled her with pride. She realized that with each new comment, with each new support, her actions became more and more significant. The officer, realizing that his reputation was at stake, began to panic. He tried to call for reinforcements, but Emily knew that he no longer had the power. She herself had now become a symbol of the struggle, and this gave her confidence. "We will fight for justice," she shouted, addressing the crowd. "We will not allow anyone to intimidate us." Emily knew that her actions had already attracted the attention of not only ordinary people, but also journalists who had begun to cover the story. She heard someone in the crowd shout, "Get out of here with him. We know what he did." The chanting of these words only increased the pressure on the officer. Soon, the sound of sirens began to fill the air, and Emily felt the officer's fear reach its limit. He began to realize that his time was running out. When additional police arrived on the scene, they found the situation had changed dramatically. Emily, surrounded by the crowd, stood confidently, showing that they had not come in peace, but with the intention of restoring justice. "What's going on here?" asked one of the new officers, approaching Emily. "This man beat me," she said, pointing at the officer, who now looked scared and vulnerable. "I'm filing a complaint against him for his actions. We have to stop the violence." Soon, journalists were on the scene, ready to cover the events. Emily knew this was her chance to make sure everyone knew the truth. She knew her video was the foundation for justice. The officers, seeing the support and determination of the people, realized that the situation was getting out of control. The hatred they professed was stopped. Emily smiled, seeing how the officer who once threatened her now gave in to the pressure of truth and justice. "I'm not just the mayor's daughter," she said to the crowd. which was buzzing with approval. "I'm the voice of justice, and we're all here to say, this won't happen again." With those words, Emily felt her heart fill with hope. She knew that with each new step they were getting closer to change. Their fight was just beginning, and she was ready to lead people to justice. The crowd around Emily was buzzing with excitement and support. Every word she spoke was a powerful manifesto for anyone who had ever felt oppressed and forgotten. The officer who had threatened her earlier now looked pathetic and helpless, and it felt like the hatred and oppression had lost its power. As more police arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. One of the new officers, younger and seemingly more perceptive, approached Emily. "We received your messages," he said, looking into her eyes. "We're here to sort out the situation." Emily knew her voice needed to be heard. She turned to the crowd and said, "We will not tolerate violence. We are here to show that justice is more important than fear." The crowd roared again in support. Emily realized that her story had now moved beyond the rally. She had become a symbol of change for many. It occurred to her that her actions could help change the system. The officers began filing paperwork and taking statements. Emily felt like they were taking her words seriously. She continued to speak, describing how racism and violence had ruined lives and how important it was to unite against these issues. As word of the incident began to spread on social media and in the news, Emily knew that her story had caught the attention of not only the public but also high-ranking officials. Journalists were calling to discuss the incident, and Emily became the face of the fight against injustice. "I will fight for those who cannot speak," she shouted, turning to the cameras, "and I will do this until everyone who suffers from racism gets their justice." From that moment on, Emily's life changed. She realized that her fight was just beginning, and now she had not only the support of people, but also the power to change the system. Her name was out there, and she knew it would continue. A few days later, at a formal press conference, Emily joined the mayor and other activists in giving a speech calling for police reform and fair treatment for people of all races. She felt like her words were making a difference, and that wave of change was already gaining momentum. "I believe that we can change our society," she said with sincerity, making everyone listen to her. "We must unite to build a world where everyone feels safe and protected." When Emily left the conference, she felt like she had thousands of people behind her, ready to support her. She knew that every word, every action mattered, and in that moment, she felt like her fight was not in vain. Looking boldly into the future, Emily knew that together with like-minded people, they could break down the wall of hatred and build a new reality based on love, respect, and justice. Emily became not only a symbol of change, but also living proof that even in the darkest times, you can find light if you fight for your rights and the rights of others. With this hope in her heart, she confidently stepped forward, ready for new challenges, but now with the confidence that justice would be achieved. Emily looked up at the sunny sky, realizing that her fight was just beginning, but she was no longer alone. The crowd gathered behind her were not just spectators, but active participants in change. Every voice, every cry of support filled her with determination. Her story inspired many at rallies and on social media. People began to unite, creating a movement based on the values of equality and justice. With each passing day, they achieved greater success, achieving changes in politics and public consciousness. Emily knew the road to justice was long and hard, but she was ready for the challenge. She continued to speak at rallies, doing her best to raise the voices of those who had ever experienced oppression. With every word she spoke, she truly believed that they could change the world. A few months later, as new laws and initiatives began to be passed, Emily felt her heart swell with pride. She saw her allies and supporters making real changes that would help people. At one of the large rallies where many people had gathered, Emily raised her hand, calling for everyone's attention. "We did this together," she cried. "Each of us contributed to this fight. This is not the end, but only the beginning of our journey. We will continue to stand by each other and fight for justice until there is no room for hatred in our society." The crowd responded with a deafening roar of approval. Emily felt the power of unity fill the atmosphere, and it gave her hope for a better future. At that moment, she realized that her story was not only her personal struggle, but also a symbol of the importance of uniting for a common cause. Emily knew that change is possible if people are willing to unite and stand up for their rights. With this sense of determination and hope, she continued on her way, confident that together they could make the world a better place. The sun was shining brightly, and every step forward was a step towards a new reality, where justice and equality would be the core values of society. And thank you for being with us on this journey. It is so important to us to know your thoughts on our story. How did it make you feel? Have you had any experiences of racism in your life that you would like to share? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us and to anyone who faces similar situations. We appreciate each of you and are grateful that you are with us. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. This helps us grow and share even more important stories. Have a great day and look forward to seeing your comments.